basically the idea now, we're going to follow up on the deck that Timo presented before about data modeling, and we're going to go on the deep dive with schema design questions. Basically, we have here on the stage, once again, John Page, welcome back. And we have our principal engineer, Asia Kamsky.
Hello.
And Timo will be moderating this part, so I leave you guys here and enjoy. Don't block your questions, like this is your moment. So anything you have, this is
Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Exactly.
They will be gone like then after.
There's no such thing as a
they will be
stupid
not
question.
back to Frankfurt, so take advantage of
Except for the questions that we make up ourselves. If you don't ask any, those will be stupid questions.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
We're going to make a point of punishing you for not asking questions by making up stupid questions.
Definitely.
Also, John and I are open to answering questions about, it doesn't have to be data modeling, could be aggregation, could be secret go faster buttons. Oh, shoot, I wasn't supposed to mention that one.
Great. Yeah, so really feel free to ask anything that you have, because with these two, you have the elite of MongoDB more or less sitting here.
So if they talk into that mic.
Yeah, they talk into this one. So after I had my talk, I will do some exercise now, or get some exercise. So if you have questions, just let me know, raise your hand.
But if they talk into that mic,
will we hear them from this?
We won't hear it. They'll all hear the question and we won't. So we're just going to answer something random.
Let me solve that for you, if I can be of any use.
My daughter is deaf, so I have a lot of experience.
I kind of like the idea of answering made-up questions.
A completely random answer.
So, now they can definitely hear you.
I've used these before.
So, yeah, great.
They were good.
These are the like those.
So really, don't feel shy on your questions. You have the elite here. I really like when I started in MongoDB, I actually looked at Asia's Slack profile and really liked the title that she had there, Principal Know-It-All. And I find that very suitable. Like, if she cannot find an answer or at least a theory to something, then you have a question on your hand. I haven't seen it yet.
Actually, no. If I don't know the answer, I just make one up.
Yeah, fair enough.
But it's usually very plausible.
All right. So really, feel free. But before we actually give the stage to you, maybe one question I have to you two is, there's a term that I find quite contradicting, that is MongoDB is schema-less.
No! You used that word in your talk, and I was like, I'm making a mental note to yell at him for it. It is not schemaless.
I said people say MongoDB is
I know, and that's wrong.
And it's not. That's what
it's not schemaless. Like, if you look at a document on a display, you can tell immediately what the schema of it is, right? You see the field names, you see the field values, you see their data types. What MongoDB is it's very laid back and casual about not enforcing any particular schema other than _ID must exist and must be unique. Unless, like John demonstrated, you can create validators, right? So we call it flexible schema, or some fancy terms for it could be like polymorphic schema, or I don't know, user-driven, I don't know. But yeah.
Great. So you're officially saying schemaless is a wrong term. We should say flexible.
Flexible schema, dynamic schema.
Great. So you now have the chance to ask questions. Just raise your hand. Also, if you don't feel comfortable asking your question in English, don't worry. Just ask them in German to me. I will translate them. Perfectly fine. Happy to do that. Any takers so far? Just raise your hand and I will run. It doesn't matter how far behind you are or how far in the back you're sitting.
Do you speak any other languages?
Ein bisschen Deutsch. Nicht sehr
viel.
He's got that covered. I can cover Russian, so if you want to ask your question in Russian, we can do that.
I can do it in Broad Scots.
Hi.
Hello.
You just said that embedding in documents is preferred. Mm-hmm. Will that work with data online archiving? Mm-hmm. So is it possible to have like embedded data archived within a document?
I'm not the one answering question, right? Archiving documents that are embedded. So, or maybe there's one clarification question. Are you meaning you want to archive only the part that is embedded or the full document?
No, the embedded part.
Ah, okay. That is a much more interesting question.
So to clarify this, we have a document, embedded in it are multiple documents, and some of those you want to archive.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Excellent question. I mean, so one thing you have to remember is And we ourselves, a lot of times, kind of go back and forth. An array is just a data type, right? You have a document. One of the fields happens to have a data type that's an array. Inside the array are objects. They're not technically MongoDB documents. They're not stored as a document in the collection. Now, they could be. You could archive them by, for example, running an aggregation pipeline, the output of which goes into whatever archive S3, whatever you have your archiving endpoint defined as. So you could do an unwind, right, to end up with just the array elements flattened. But a lot of times when people say they want to archive, what they mean is the stuff they archive, they want to automatically delete it from the original collection. And I don't believe we have anything built in for that. I mean, you could obviously write a script or a job.
So the best I could see would be essentially 2 merge jobs, one of which sends it out to S3 and the other one deletes
Updates.
it, or just an update many.
An update.
So,
because you want to make sure it's written to the archive. You don't want to make it like,
yes.
send the write, delete it, and then find out the write gave you an error. That would be sad.
Yeah, so if you had tolerance for it existing in both for a while, I think I would write something that read older array elements and wrote them out to my archive, and then I'd write something to delete anything from the array that was over a certain age. Both of which you could do with like a single command. Might take a little while to run.
Yep.
Great.
That's a good question, right? Because I've actually run into folks that had a performance issue because they had, essentially some current detail in a large array with some summary fields in the top level. And they were never thinking about the fact that they now had this huge, large document history that, beyond the first few months, most recent few months, they were only using to aggregate, max, min, averages that were top-level fields. But we can't read top-level fields without reading the whole document in, right? And so their RAM was just getting trashed until they realized that now they need to essentially convert those documents into just having the summary because they didn't need the details. I can't remember if it was like 4 weeks or 3 months or whatever. So
There is another
question.
approach to this as well.
there are,
So, as Asya said, large arrays, really large arrays, are something of an anti-pattern. You have to think, do I really want all of that information embedded? Or am I only generally retrieving the latest 10? So let's say it's my Amazon orders. So I have probably in the region of 3,000 Amazon orders over the years. But normally I only want to look at the last month's worth of them because those are the things I'm wondering, how do I return this? It's terrible. And so one way you can do that would be when a new order comes in, you write it to 2 collections. One of which is the orders collection, which contains every order ever, and you can use any, and it's 1 order per document. And you also use a combination of push each slice to add that latest order into the sort of person document, the main document that you're going to show for somebody's orders, and say, have this, automatically remove anything over a certain age, or just keep the last 10.
keep the most recent 3
So you keep
or
a
5
sort
or
of summarized
whatever,
view in there, and that makes it easier. But that would be a better data model overall if you can, because you're only ever having to touch and retrieve the stuff you really need, and you're kind of implicitly archiving the older things.
A similar scenario, actually where I thought you were going with this, is if you have the bucket pattern, right? The detailed array with some summaries, but you only need that, let's say, for 4 weeks. But the summaries you need for a long time, the detail can be like archived off. You could literally write to 2 collections, right? The last 4 weeks collection has the detail. The summary collection has just the top level field summary. And TTL stuff out of the detail document or archive it off, whichever. There's a lot of, this is the great thing and the horrible thing about a flexible schema.
Obviously, you have asked a very good question, right? One question, we have a 15-minute presentation.
We can literally talk
continuously.
about any given use case for as
Okay,
long as...
well, maybe let's move on. We have another question here.
Sure.
Thank you.
I know it's weird when you hear yourself, isn't it?
Echoing back. So the question is, With the relational databases, there was this message that you have to normalize the database.
Yes.
Store everything only once.
Yes.
This is what made a theoretical good database. Though for performance reasons,
Yes.
you had to change this and denormalize a bit.
Yep.
Now it seems like MongoDB's approach is absolutely the other way around. Put everything at one place and as the application dictates it, of course.
Yep.
Understand it right, please. And then if performance somehow dictates you have to normalize it a bit. So how do you measure when you actually have to normalize in MongoDB?
You don't usually have to normalize. We don't call it that. We call it, how do you change the scheme? You might need to. So I have a funny story about this, slightly related to this, because I spent 10, 15 years working with relational databases before I even ever heard of MongoDB, which was about 11, 12 years ago. And this was a startup. There were like 3 of us, or 4 of us, and I knew that the first, the 2 founders, but not the third person. So we met once to make sure, we could work together. And he said, oh, so, you do the data modeling, data architect, backend, DBA, whatever. I have a question for you, something I've always wanted to understand. So when you create the schema for this thing we're trying to build, how do you know it's the right schema? And I go, well, that's easy. I know it's going to be the wrong schema. I know it for a fact because we were a startup. We were going to pivot 7 times before we even got to 1.0. And the thing that was like the afterthought stuck somewhere in those 2 tables in the very corner that didn't even fit on the diagram, they ended up being the center of the product, right? Because they tickled the fancy of some VC or customer number 1, right? And you end up changing and rewriting everything. So normalization was great because it allowed you to have mediocre performance for any query you wanted, except for an OLAP type queries, right? Because theoretically, a normalized database allows you to join the data whichever way you need for any kind of query. Except, why did we have to build so many star schema data marts specifically for analytical queries? Because relational normalized schema could not handle it. Right? If you have dynamic variables, right, and you have a table of variable name, variable value, and then you're doing 7 self-joins in order to slice and dice it, that does not scale, right? And you usually know that as soon as you run the query and okay, here I am sitting for 20 minutes, that's not going to work. In MongoDB, what's going to happen at some point is somebody says, we're also going to need this type of answer out of this data. And you go, okay, that sounds like it's going to be a long, fancy, complicated aggregation. I'm going to run it against my analytical node, and it gives me an answer in 90 seconds instead of 90 milliseconds or microseconds, right, on the OLAP part of the system. And then your business owner says, oh yeah, but this is going to be run by customers all the time, so it needs to be sub 50 milliseconds. And that's when and you go, okay, I need to change something in the schema. So you're never changing things because, oh, I'm duplicating the data too much. Disk space is just not expensive anymore, right? I have more storage on my phone than every mainframe put together the year that I was born, right? I mean, it's just mind-boggling. We have more RAM on a Raspberry Pi than a mainframe used to have in total storage. So I wouldn't particularly worry about data being duplicated. The other thing is denormalization sometimes saves you space. Right? The most obvious case is we were talking about orders. So if you have a table of orders and a table of line items in those orders, right? You're duplicating that order ID. But more importantly, you're duplicating an index because you're indexing order IDs here, but you also have to index them here combined with line item ID. And it turns out when you embed, your data gets a little bit smaller. You're actually not repeating anything, right? You're not repeating the same order number on every line item. They're just an array. So it's actually a little bit less space. You also no longer need indexes on that second table. So, and I wrote a paper that VLDB published in 2019 which was essentially adapting TPCC benchmark, which is a commerce benchmark that traditional databases used for several decades, adapting them to MongoDB and showing how changing the schema actually decreases the space used, not increases. So there are some generalizations, sure, but the specifics don't always hold to the generalization. Right? John, what you got to add?
I don't know if I want to add to that or go for a completely different answer.
Go for it. That's what I want.
So I tend to, firstly, I don't subscribe to this idea of embed everything at all.
Oh, I don't either. Embed when it's right.
Yeah, only embed when it's the correct thing to do. So there are various kinds of things you would join in a relational database. And so if we work through the kinds of tables you have, the first set are your, if you like, your domain tables, your things that have a list of countries or a list of vehicle makes or models. So that's the obvious one that absolutely you would embed, because joining that at runtime is just going to be an expensive pain. You don't want to do that. You can embed it. They don't change all that often. It's not often that somebody takes the name of a country and decides it's going to be called something else.
I mean,
and if it does happen that you have to take all the Sudans and split them into Sudan and South Sudan, you've got a bigger problem to worry about than changing a bunch of fields and a million records in a database. So the first thing is denormalize all your domain tables. Unless you have an exception, that's going to be super easy to do. The next one is when we think about something like an address, and that's the example that people often give is, hey, it's an address. I want to have data integrity, so I should have one copy of the person's address. But in reality, you end up with a table which has various historical addresses for that person, and you have things linked to different historical addresses, because when I embed an address in an invoice, I don't want that to change when the customer moves. I want to keep the address we delivered that invoice to. That's the legal document. I'm also going to want to have a customer ID number in there that links to some canonical definition of the customer. So my general take is define which copy of the data is the master definitive copy. And if you ever absolutely need to know where that customer lives, go to the customer record, go to their definitive address part in there. But also, don't blindly think about embedding and not embedding. MongoDB puts more responsibility on developers. Okay. Actually, I'm going to drop a horrible thought here. Document databases, like MongoDB, are less flexible than relational databases, because you actually need to have some idea of what you're doing with them. Yes, you can adapt that over time, but you can give somebody and say, go and design a data model for this data. I don't know at all what I'm going to do with it, but just design me an RDBMS data model and every application can notionally use it.
Yeah,
Badly.
you can't do that.
They can just turn it into normal form. And there was a reason for that, back in the 1960s, when everybody wanted to have one database. But,
That's what they could afford.
Actually, for a document database, you need to have some idea of your access pattern. So it is that bit harder to model, but it's going to be so much quicker to work with.
Yeah.
You're optimizing. You're actually doing the same thing that DBAs do when they go, okay, right, I'm going to have to work out how to cluster this table, because it turns out people tend to retrieve rows around this field and multiple. You're just bringing that up front and letting the developer decide how the data is organized and clustered.
And the developer is already thinking about that when they're creating their class hierarchy, right? They're already thinking about data types, right? I mean, many languages that people work with are a strong type, right? You already are saying this thing is going to be this type, this thing is going to be this thing is associated with many of those things, right? You have various decision points where you could choose to store something together or separately. Yep. But you're already thinking about these things, right? Is this class something that has a list of attributes, or is this class that has, is associated with a group of some other class? I think the developers would, by the time they're done thinking about those data structures, already have thought 80% of what they need to think about to come up with a good MongoDB schema. And I do worry that the developers and DBAs and ops folks being more separate, as they may be in a larger corporation, is problematic, right? Because then you have DBA who's like, well, I have no idea what the developer was thinking. They just press the button and their application is live, and I'm responsible for making it perform. Been there, done that, burnt that T-shirt, right? That is a problem. But the fact is that it's. I've always said if you have a developer who doesn't know the first thing about databases, I would rather that they be creating an application that uses MongoDB, where the entities are a little closer related to what they do know, which is the entities in the code. Because if they're using a relational database, it's going to be a huge, big mess, in my experience.
Great. Yeah.
Good question.
Did that,
We can
did that
tie
answer the
everything
question?
into everything.
You see, with the right question, we have already 2 50-minute talk. We're
There
done.
you go.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for that.
And by the way, while you pass the mic on, TPCH is a famous data warehouse benchmark, which prescribes a relational schema which has countries separate from regions with a foreign key relationship. And I'm like, is this in case France decides to move from Europe to South America or something? Like, to me, it makes so little sense to do that. It's literally an academic exercise, right? Full normalization just doesn't make sense to me in that way.
It's like, I've seen that in code where somebody's done,
Yeah.
hash define pi
like, I have to-
2.145,
Yeah.
just in case pi changes.
Just in case. It could happen, right? Anyway, yes.
I
Yeah, weird, right?
this is kind of I just want to also related to the data modeling. I just want to bring up the example from Timo's talk just now, where we had a collection of articles, and in each document of each article you had your comments.
Comments,
And you have
yep.
a separate collection of people. And now, let's say you want to store a list of comments for each person, and you store that in each person document, but you also want to store
Yeah.
in the comment who
Yep.
made the comment. And
Yep.
now
No, both wrong.
Simplistic
you
example.
want to delete something,
Yeah.
right? How do you, I mean, John mentioned in the last one upstairs,
Yeah.
keeping data integrity within one document with the averages. If you, you validate that the document, that the average field is still the average of your array. Can you do that across collections to make sure that
So no,
No.
you cannot. But also, you don't really want to. And so here's why. Whenever that slide, no offense, Steve, but whenever that slide comes up, I really want to scream, "No! Don't embed the comments in the post," because next
it's
thing you
subset
know,
pattern,
a
right?
flame war breaks out. And there's 10,000 comments, and they're all embedded in one poor little post. And guess what happens when you come to somebody's blog to read the post? While the post is loading, you're reading it, you're scrolling. You have like 5 minutes to load the comments from wherever they live. Frankly, use a third party to store the comments.
A third collection to store the copy.
No, I meant third party. Like, I use Discourse. There's absolutely no reason to store the comments. They already built a system for comments, right? But the point is that you've all seen this, right? When you scroll down to the bottom, you see the little thing that says loading comments, and it loads the comments for that blog post. Which ones? Either the most recent ones or the oldest ones or the highest ranked ones, whichever way they sort. And they only fetch the first 3, 5 page full, screen full, right? Because nobody ever needs to see 1,000 comments that are associated with that blog post, right? So I would not store, I might store in, like, when I log into a system, whatever it is that's on my front page, right? Most recent comment on your most recent blog post, I can see caching that essentially in the document, right? So that you only have to read one document to show somebody their home page. But that would be driven by whatever your business requirements are. And I'm going to make another comment that might make some of the old-timers and would make the old-timer me roll my eyes. But so you lose referential integrity with comments on a blog post. Does anybody really care? Right? It's like one of the training exercises in our developer training used to be, maybe still is, I haven't given it for a few years, designing an e-commerce type system where you have products and you have reviews and you have comments on reviews. Like, what do you embed where? And it's like, well, when you go to Amazon and you see a product displayed, you see the average score. but you don't see the detailed comments except maybe one most helpful critical comment and one most helpful complimentary comment. Whatever you see on that first page, it makes sense to embed in the product. But everything else should just be in its own collection. And if a bunch of reviews come in and your nightly job that recalculates the average score doesn't run for a few hours, then oh my God, that product will still say 3.73 even though it should now be 3.76. What are you going to do, sue Amazon? Right? And the fact is, a lot of times people ask us, like, how do I let the customer sort by anything, paginate to an arbitrary page in a arbitrarily large result set and a whole bunch of other requirements? And I go, have you ever searched your Gmail or Amazon products where the first result says 1,200 matches, and when you go to the second page, it says, just kidding, there's 15,000. By the time you go to the next page, it says, oh, now I found 32,000. So they're just fetching more of them, right? There's no guarantees, and when you search tomorrow, you'll get a slightly different result set. So I kind of feel like a lot of times people go, but I used to be able to have everything in a relational database. I'm like, and you also used to pay $5 million a year to the relational database vendor to have it, plus the hardware vendor.
You also couldn't query it on an arbitrary set of columns,
That too.
sort by an arbitrary column and page.
And for some reason, we think that because the schema is flexible, we should now be able to flexibly query on anything.
Although, if you listen to the people that make Atlas Search, they'll tell you it doesn't.
They'll tell you you can. But you know what? It's like designing a car, right? It can go this fast, it can get this kind of fuel economy, but if you want both of those numbers to be really good, it's going to cost a lot of money, right? If you want to only spend this much money, you can't have this much car. Same with the database, right?
I have one last tip on that, which is when you look...
3 minutes left.
Yeah. When you look at your schema, when you look at what's going on, and you look at an array, ask yourself, will this array ever have more than 200 things in it? And if that array will have more than 200 things, change your schema.
Unless you ask yourself, do I always have to get every array element? So there was one, I've been doing this for over 10 years, and I remember exactly one case where they had big arrays, and they legitimately needed all the things in that array. Because essentially their use case was the program that fetched the document did a certain computation combined with risk assessment that had to take into account the full history of the record. And that meant that, if they got so big that they needed to split it in 2 documents, they'd need to fetch 2 documents because this was a use case where they had to have access to all the data. They couldn't leave old history because then they might come up with the wrong answer. There's a question, I think, in the 4th, 5th row there. And we'll probably have time for one more until we go drinking at the happy hour, and then you can ask all kinds of questions, and we'll tell you all kinds of things we would never say when we're mic'd. No, I'm just kidding. I will say anything when I'm mic'd that I would say when I'm not mic'd. There's no filter here.
You said in the answer before, I think that was John, that basically a relational database is in a sense more flexible than MongoDB because, the schema, like the database, is not coupled to the application.
Yep.
Now, would it make sense, that might be a stupid question. I'm like a physicist by education. I have no idea what I'm doing here. Well, I do, but...
I'm a geologist, so don't ask me.
I'm a computer scientist.
So basically, if we have some data, would it make sense to separate the, so to say, operational manifestation of a data entity, which is used in the application, and it's adapted to the needs of the application? Let's say if I want to also have this information, like in archives for sometime later, for maybe 10, like in 5 years, if a customer comes and says, hey, the satellite we built with your product just doesn't work anymore, you have to check if you messed something up so we can sue you. And we'd have to be able to look it up. Would it make sense to separate a data, to have like separate representations, say one for this like operational projection of what we use in MongoDB, and the rest to keep it more agnostic of the application and say put it in the archive?
You know what he just described, right? You know more about databases and how they've been used traditionally than you think, because you literally have described what happened at so many organizations where they said this one normalized database is the system of record, and then every department ended up having to do their own snapshot, pull the data, transform it so that it would perform reasonably well for their use case. And then the central data architect team would yell at them and be like, you're not supposed to keep a copy of this data. There's only one place for the data.
Yeah. I think
Yeah, exactly.
there's a couple of ways to answer that question.
Yeah.
I would go with, with MongoDB, even if it's in a document model, even if it's not normalized, we're not saying you can't query it, slice it, dice it, any direction you like. It's very much, it's optimized for one use case at the expense of another.
Yep.
So what happens is, for your application, it's going to be super quick because the data is laid out in a way that makes that application work. If you want to do something, I'm going to use a big word now, which is a funny thing in a foreign country, orthogonal to that completely.
Great word.
Okay, so I want to look at one field across 1 billion 1 megabyte documents, then yeah, your document model is probably not as optimized as what you're describing, which would, some kind of column store. Hey, did anybody hear something about column store indexes earlier?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what you could do is, just leave it in MongoDB, implement those great column store indexes, and then, yeah, you're going to be able to slice it and dice it completely orthogonal to the way that you had the data stored in the first place. So
The dirty secret of, document databases in MongoDB is we're already doing that, right?
Yeah.
It's just an index is a different way of storing your data. Lucene search index, that's just a different way of storing your data, right? You're telling us, oh, now that I've stored the data here, I also want to query it a certain way, right? When you build an index, you're saying, I want to query my data a certain way. It's not that different from saying, I'm going to extract some of this data into a different storage format. Columnar indexes. Analytical secondaries that maybe someday will have different storage engines to be optimized for some other type of querying, right? It's just we're trying to reduce the mental load to the person setting it up, where they just say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and they've already thought about it as part of building their application, right? In reality, under the hood, to answer queries efficiently, we still have to do some stuff that's definitely not magic. It's physics, right? Place data together that you want to be able to fetch quickly together. If you want to filter by something, have a data structure that allows you to very quickly filter out that data, right? Those indexes. The more indexes you have, the more costs is associated with various rights. So the trade-offs are always happening. It's just, it's not so much that we're not as flexible, we're just making you answer some of these questions up front in order to get that better performance that you keep hearing about people having. If you don't, you'll just get below average performance, and then you'll be like, well, great, it's flexible and easy to work with, but it's not all that fast. Yeah, because, you didn't optimize it for speed, you optimized it for ease of use. Yeah, I know the thing's been flashing zeros.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, John. Thank you, Asya. And thank you for you asking questions.
Thanks for staying this late.
Interactive, yeah. And with that,
Appreciate
Ola,
it.
Everyone.
let us know how we continue.
Oh, we're into happy hour.
The last talk of today, last Q&A. Once again, thank you very much for coming here. It was a pleasure to especially see you in physical way, not only on Zoom.